Oh hey! I'm sure this was quite an awkward intro, I apologize for that. But since I moved back to my parents' house, I can't get the help of my friends with the intros and photographs. All you see is completely self-shot. Watch till the end of the tutorial for a glimpse into my psychological state. Anyway, Krampus. I didn't make any Halloween tutorials this year, but what about a spooky Christmas one? Before we get into the details, I'd like to talk a bit about the Krampus lore. He is part of the Alpine folklore. His role is to come out at the same time as Santa Claus, but take care of the naughty children by scaring them and swatting them with the perch rod. He is often depicted with hair, with horns, pointy ears, a long pointed tongue, fangs, chains to symbolize the binding of the devil by the Christian church, and a basket to carry the children in. I included some of those characteristics in order to make my own version. I hope you like it. Let's go! We are going to start with a mask. I used this face cast that wanted to be my face but couldn't make it. Anyway, I used their drying clay, which is usually not preferred in this type of sculpting, but I am a castaway in the middle of Crete and I don't have access to many things. With my little rolling pin, I flatten a piece of clay and lay it on top of the forehead. With my fingers, I smooth out the edges but leave a tiny bit of space between the smoothed out clay and the edge of the cast so that later the prosthetic can touch my face in those areas. You're going to see a lot of the back of my head in this tutorial, I'm sorry. You can use any sculpting tools that work for you as well. I smooth out the edges of the clay on top of the eyebrows the same way I did before. I like having a very thin clay base on top of which I can add more clay in the shapes that I want. I roughly sketched the placement of the forehead wrinkles and the eyebrow wrinkles based on a really good Krampus mask I found online. I do the same on the right cheek. Lay a thin piece of clay to cover the area, smooth out the edges and mark the placement of the wrinkles. And I continue with the rest of the face. I left a big gap around the mouth because I wanted him to have his mouth wide open and his huge tongue out like he is often depicted. And I built up mainly the lower jaw because it will look better with a bit of depth. A big nose is a must as well. And now I'm starting to add the actual wrinkles. All you need to do now is make sausages. Make many sausages. Long, short, thick, thin, and everything in between. Lay each sausage wherever you want a wrinkle and smooth out the sides a bit with a sculpting tool. In cases like this, the wrinkle doesn't have to be perfectly smoothed out because the latex is going to take away some of the details, which is why I made some very distinct and left them looking a bit too much. They won't later. I made 2 big ones for the eyebrows and 3 smaller ones for the forehead. For the sides of the nose, I made about 3 for each side, making the ones on the bottom very intense. I added some clay on the cheekbones and with some water on my fingertip I smoothed them out while also carving a couple of dents below them. Feel free to add more clay wherever you want. I added small wrinkles below the eyebrows and above the cheekbones and I carved some lines on the lips. After the clay had dried, I sanded the edges and below the cheekbones for a smoother finish. Now the sculpt is ready to be latexed. I was out of isopropyl mirror state, so I used a fair amount of powder. You have to make sure it gets into every dent so you can remove the latex later. I am using a fluffy brush to spread it everywhere. Then with a makeup sponge I pick up some liquid latex and start spreading it in stippling motions on top of the clay. The first layer is always the hardest because the latex starts sticking to itself after a bit of stippling due to the powder underneath. So after covering most of the sculpt in latex, I used Q-tips for about 2 layers and then switched again to sponges to create some even texture. I make sure latex covers the whole thing and gets inside small lines with either Q-tips or the pointy end of my sculpting tool. When a layer dries, it's time for the next one. I used a similar method for my zombie tutorial, if you want to check it out. So you will have to create many layers, like many. And when you think they are enough, you have to do more and more. About 2 days and a million layers later, I felt like it was ready, or I was just tired of doing the same thing over and over again. Anyway, you want to powder it before you start peeling it off slowly and very, very carefully. You don't want to lose all your hard work. And as I peel, I powder the inside. Once it is all powdered, I put it back because it's time to paint. For the paint job, I use some alcohol activated paints for in between the wrinkles, but quickly switched to water activated paints because I just like them more, okay? These are the Mayor on Paradise paints. Please sponsor me. With a small sea sponge, I spread some grey paint with stippling motions all over the face. Then I go in with some yellow to brighten it and some red to give it some life. With black and a small brush, I darken the insides of the mouth and the nose, as well as in between the wrinkles. Using the sea sponge again, I spread some very light foundation on top. This way it's going to give the illusion of skin that is discolored underneath. I use some white body paint with a thin brush to highlight the wrinkles, the sides of the mouth. Oops, small break because my mom brought me fruit. The nose and cheeks. I thought of sealing the paint job with hairspray for some reason, but I think it's better to not do it with hairspray because it got shiny and I didn't want that. I wanted to add a very long beard on his chin by cutting a lock of an old black wig and sticking it on. However, I have a history of unsuccessful wig operations and this was no exception. The hair from the wig was very heavy, so spirit gum wasn't enough. I used super glue and as expected some of them stayed, but many of them fell off. You can groom it also if you want. I made the teeth using polymorph plastic, which is these white small balls. I make them malleable by using very hot water. I pour some into a glass and I open up my reference picture. I throw some of it in the water and keep it together with a spoon. I wait a couple of minutes till it turns clear and I pick up some of it carefully though because it is very hot. I quickly start shaping it with my hands into a tooth similar to what I see in the pictures. I have the mask close to me for scale. You only have around 3 to 5 minutes before it hardens and isn't malleable anymore. I wanted them to have some texture, so with a sculpting tool I carved lines onto them. If the plastic was getting harder, around this time, I dipped the tool into the hot water and continued to scratch the plastic. For the fangs, I used a pair of scissors for the sharp edges. I made a few more than I needed in order to choose the best ones or the ones that fit the mouth better. After trying them on the mask, I picked 6 for the upper jaw and 6 for the bottom jaw, even though I didn't end up using them, which I deeply regret. I thought I was going to have the tongue on the entire time, but... So I painted them with alcohol activated paints. I used some yellow and brown, which I let seep into the scratches and wiped the surface of each tooth, making them look deeply dirty. Something I forgot to make earlier in the process was gums, so I'm just gonna do this real quick with small sausages of clay placed right below his supposed lips. I used the teeth I made to create the right dents into the clay and I follow the same procedure as before. Powder, layers of latex, powder. I tried to take off some of the clay underneath, but it's a very small amount, so it didn't matter. With alcohol paints, I paint them red and black on the deeper parts. Finally, I glued them on each of their spot. Now the tongue! In order to make it, I had to sculpt the mold and fill it in with gelatin. So I took a block of clay and shaped it into a very thick rectangle. After I was happy with the thickness, I popped it inside the mouth of the mask to check that its width would be right. I carve out the shape I wanted to have on the clay, and later I dig into the shape in order to make a small pool to fill in. I smooth it out and I make a straight line in the middle for, that line we have underneath our tongues. It won't be visible later, so it's not necessary, but I want it to be accurate. Before the clay starts drying, I find a way to prop the mold so it can take the shape I want the tongue to have. I use a small bowl and later my smaller rolling pin. We're going to need a lid for that mold, so I make a thin piece of clay that covers it. I also use a tiny sausage for the middle because our tongues have that, dent in the middle. I smooth the edges, of course. Our tongues also have, some interesting texture on top, so I poked tiny holes all over the lid. I quickly figured out that the mold wasn't deep enough for the tongue to form nicely, so I built up the edges with, again, thin sausages. When the mold had mostly dried, it was time to make the gelatin. I used 2 scoops of gelatin, 2 scoops of glycerin, and around 3 scoops of water. I stirred it and realized I need another batch, so I used the same measurements once again. And I put it in the microwave for about 15 seconds at a time till it becomes fully liquid. I wanted it to be a deep red color, so I mixed in a few drops of fake blood, and that didn't seem dark enough to me, so I dripped some black tempera paint in, and then it turned brown. Whatever, I ended up covering it with fake blood anyway. I start pouring it inside the mold and I move the mold around to make sure it covers it. Some of it is inevitably going to spill because of the vertical position, but it's okay, it's very easy to clean up. After I have filled the mold, I place the lid on top and move it around. You can place the dried gelatin back to your container and in the fridge and reheat it whenever you want. I place the mold in the fridge as well and I wait a couple of hours before taking it out. With gentle but firm motions, I slowly try to detach the lid from the dried gelatin that is underneath. After a while, the lid was removed. I took out the middle part that was stuck in the tongue and then removed again very carefully the tongue. It's very expected that there will be gaps, but that is okay. I lay the tongue back to its mold, I reheat some gelatin and I pour some of it in the gaps. I cover it and put it in the fridge again. I was very happy with it, so I got lazy and didn't make another one to have for the shoot, and that was a big mistake. Moving along. For the horns I followed a similar method as the demon tutorial. I will rush a bit here because there are a million tutorials out there for the same thing. First, I take a big chunk of air drying clay which I shape into a horn. I check the size and overall look by holding it on my head in the mirror. When I'm happy with it, I let it dry overnight. Once it's dry, I cut up many strips of plaster gauze and some smaller pieces. You need to use something to seal the clay so that the plaster gauze won't stick to it. I would use cling wrap, but my mother didn't have any, so aluminum foil it is. I wrap it around the horn in a way that it doesn't get wrinkled and I keep it in place with tape. I dip the plaster gauze into a bowl of warm water and I wrap it around the horn. With my fingers I spread the plaster to smooth the gauze and I do it until I cover the entire horn. Towards the tip I use some of the smaller pieces of gauze. I make a second layer and after I let it dry for about an hour, I carve a line along the horn with my cutter. Then very carefully I take the clay horn out and I patch the cut up part with more plaster gauze. And I make another layer of it. I did this whole thing twice, so I got 2 horns. Hey, who would have thought? You can just paint them now, but I wanted a certain texture. So I used really thin pieces of clay to cover them. Then I carved lines along the direction of the horns and let them air dry. I used acrylic paints for the paint job and before anything else I used very dark brown for the dents. To cover the base I used the same dark brown, dragging it further out, but I darkened it a bit more on the base with black. What? Then I used the lighter brown for most of the horn, blending it out with a darker base. On the tips I went in with white, which I also used to highlight certain parts of the rest of the horn. For the final look I stuck them on a hairband with super glue because otherwise they wouldn't stay. Ear time! I'm getting tired, but we have a long way to go. For the ears, I tried to make some similar to mine out of clay in order to build up the prosthetic on top. I kept shaping the clay with my fingers and trying it on in the mirror to check the size. I wanted them to stop where this part of the actual ear is, so that later the prosthetic can be glued on the bottom of it to hide the edge better. I don't know if that makes sense to you. When I was happy with it, I molded some clay of a different color to create the prosthetic part. I cut a triangle shape that went over the front of the ear and stopped at the bottom. Using my fingers, I tried to mold it as close as I could to an elf-like ear. I dug up some pits to make it look more realistic. I built up some clay in the back too, so there would be a bridge connecting it to the back of my ear as well. And once they are dry, you know the drill, lots of powder, layers of latex and drying them in between. I know they are ready to be removed when I can see the yellow from the latex and they are not completely clear. I peel them off slowly and I use powder with confidence. I pop them back in and paint them like I did the mask. Le costume. Many people use Santa costumes for Krampus, but I wanted it to look more authentic. Like he came straight out of the woods with pieces of cloth that he uses to just keep him covered and a bit warm. So I used burlap for the sleeves. My parents had 2 sacks they didn't need, so I used them real good. I roughly measured the length of my arm and cut one side of the sack to that point and got rid of the excess. I cut the rest of the sack in the middle and was left with 2 pieces, one for each sleeve. I folded them lengthwise, and because I couldn't find my hot glue gun, I stuck the edges using a stapler, which didn't work very smoothly, but it's okay. I turn them inside out, I check that they fit and leave them on the side for now. For his legs, I really wanted to make them furry, like a real goat man, without the hooves though, but still. I found this amazing faux fur online, and after I took a couple of pictures, it was time to work with it. One thing I've been very excited to tell you is that I've been learning how to sew for a couple months now. So why not try to make a pattern? Haha. I don't know pattern making, but I went with my instinct because I just wanted a very basic pair of pants. I took some measurements and designed one pant. For a pair of pants you should have 4 big pieces, but I was in a hurry so I split them into 2. I laid my wannabe pattern on the fur and drew around it with a marker. I did this twice and cut them off. And now I have 2 pants. I fold each of them in the middle, wrong side out, and I place pins along the edges. I wanted the stitching to start from this point of the pants, which is the crotch, and end near the ankle. Here is me, working on the sewing machine. I love it. I do this for both pants and I turn them inside out, or actually right side out, or whatever, you get it. I wanted to try them on to check that they were right. They were a little tight, so I had to strip. Oh yeah, looking good. For the feet, I just tucked the secured edges using safety pins. Now for the front and back side of the pants, I sewed the sides, making sure they aligned at the crotch. I also wanted to make a tail, so I measured about 1 meter of somewhat thin strip of fur that ends to a point, folded the right sides in and sewed along the edge. And here is the pants all sewed up. I used suspenders to keep them up because they are very low-waisted and loose. I put on my mask because I'm planning on grooming the fur. Oops, I'm showing. So this fur was too fluffy for the look I was going for, so I propped up a mirror and started cutting chunks off. I know what you're going to say. If you wanted shorter hair, why not buy a fur with shorter hair? And to that I tell you, because I like this one, okay? I wanted very short hair around the feet, short hair on the calves, and longer around the thighs. so it ended up looking like this. And then I decided that it needed to be darker. And I know what you're going to say. If you wanted it to be darker, why not? Just leave me alone. I mixed up some black acrylic paint with water and I started spreading it on the fur by massaging it with my fingers. Don't forget the tail. And yes, I get disgusted sometimes. I actually liked the texture the paint left, so I hung it outside to dry. And now what I did before the photo shoot was I pinned the tail on the back of the pants. I used two very thick shoulder pads and I attached a thick elastic on the sides of the sleeves so they wouldn't slide off. Of course he has a hump, for which I used a plastic bag filled with some kind of wool stuffing. I tried to prop it up with the suspenders, but it kept sliding off later. I covered the back with a cheap Halloween cape I had. I safety pinned it to my shoulders. I told you I had another burlap sack, so I cut off the sides and kept the bottom stitching so I could drape it around my hump and over my shoulders to the front. I pinned the bottom corners of the burlap and the cape together. I also safety pinned the front of the burlap so my body would not be visible. To tie the whole outfit together, I used a cute scarf. I mean, he might be cold. He also carries chains, which I used only for some of the shots because they kept sliding off. And after all this preparation, it's time for the application. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me. I want my hair out of the way, so I hold it back with a wig cap. I glue down my eyebrows in order to shield them from the prosthetics glue that I'll be using later. I take the ears off their clay base and try them on. As expected, they didn't fit completely, but I quickly fixed them by trimming the edges with scissors. Once I like the fit, I apply some spirit gum on both my ears and the inside of the prosthetics edges, tap it to get tacky, and I glue the ear on. During this part, I look a lot like my mother's elves. To prepare my face before sticking the mask on, I wanted to paint around my eyes and mouth black. So I rip up a sponge and stipple some black water activated body paint in those areas. What is this? I try the mask on and after moving it around a bit, I mark with a black pencil where the edges are going to lay so that I know where to apply glue. I apply spirit gum on the inside of those lines and close to them. I do not put spirit gum on the center of my forehead because the mask won't make contact with my skin over there. I put some on the edges of the mask as well. After it gets tacky, I glue the forehead on and I apply some on top in areas like around my eyes where there are small parts sticking out. For the bottom part of the mask, I first glue on the lower parts of my eyes and go on with the sides of my cheeks and the bottom of the jaw. With spirit gum on the Q-tips, I apply some more on the edges that weren't completely stuck. And now a classic move. I blend the edges of the mask using liquid latex on makeup sponges. I try to apply the latex vertically to the edges so it blends more seamlessly, but you don't have to worry so much about it, it's going to be covered with hair anyway. I use some around the eyes as well, being very careful and using a Q-tip for precision. Then I tried to glue those heavy horns on my forehead, but it was a very bad decision. Anyway, it didn't work, so it's time to powder the latex and paint over it. With a ripped sea sponge, I spread some grey that matches the tone of the mask as close as possible. I darken up the eyes with more black body paint and black eyeshadow to set it. I pulled down my hair and started painting it with black body paint. At least some of it, cause Krampus ain't no brown-haired wuss. Then I decided that the wrinkles just weren't enough. So I took some of that very light foundation I used on the mask on a flat brush and started to draw more. Mainly on the sides of my jawline and the sides of my eyes. I used dark red and black in between them with a very thin brush, and I brought them closer to the mask skin tone by applying a bit of brown matte eyeshadow. I painted the lower parts of my ears black, and I started gluing faux fur around my jawline to connect it with a beard. I'm not sure that gluing faux fur on your face is a safe thing to do. Be careful with those things, guys, don't be like me. As for my neck, I painted it black with a sea sponge, and in order for it to look hairy, I used the duo fiber brush dipped in white body paint and brushed it along my neck, creating this hair-like effect. I used it on my hair and my beard as well. Ooh, are you still watching? To the two of you that are still watching, know that you have a special place in my heart. DM me to send you a cookie, or money to buy one at least. Don't forget to like, subscribe, find me on Instagram and TikTok. Just like I promised, here are some bloopers. Oh, and Merry Christmas! Bye bye! And I was so excited for this look, and now so sad and disappointed. Because it looks cool, but I can't take the pictures. I imagine I can't film the intro that I had planned. The outfit is not the way I wanted it to be. My tongue keeps getting warmer, and my body weight keeps getting smaller because I bite off the pieces. And I was stupid enough not to make more of those tongues. And I just wait for it in the freezer. Maybe I'm saving it for a couple of last pictures, but yeah, that would be it. I don't have an intro. I feel sad and organized and disappointed myself. And I don't care about that. And you know something you're never gonna see. You're never gonna see in the video. Is that everything that could go wrong with this went wrong. So here you have the best version you could have. Like it all went so bad. I was crying. I was crying before I came out here to film to try to film anything. So let me get up close to you and tell you. Don't. It sucks, man. I think I'm going through a manic episode lately. Like, oh, let's make this, let's make that, let's do this and go there, and I don't really want to do any of it. Disgusting. Anyway, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. If you are still watching, thank you, and I love you. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't post this.